Hello, my name is David McLemore. I'm the professor of tuba and euphonium at Central Washington University. And in this video I'm going to talk about the tuba audition materials for the upcoming 2020 WMEA All-State Honor Ensembles. Think of this video as a mini lesson. Our goal here is to essentially talk through the 4 tracks that you're going to need to record. I'm going to discuss how to approach each musical selection you have to prepare, and also I'm going to do a playing example of each track. So by the end of this lesson you should have a good sense for how to approach each piece of music you need to play, and you should have an oral example in your ear that you can reference in your preparation. Now, before we start talking about each individual selection you need to prepare, I want to first broach some general tips for success, things that are going to help you not just in this audition, but more broadly as a tuba player, as a brass player. First of all, and this is an important one, don't procrastinate. It can be very tempting to look at some of these materials you need to prepare. For example, the chromatic scale, the first track. It can be very tempting to look at that and say, I could play that in my sleep. That's not hard. I'm not going to need weeks and weeks to prepare that. I could prep that one night, record it the next day. It's very easy to fall into that mentality. I'm going to encourage you not to, because even if you aren't getting a head start on these materials, someone else is. Really jump on top of this. Another advantage to avoiding procrastination is that it's going to give you more time to lock down recording details, to really talk to your band director, your choir director, your orchestra director, and really set up the logistics for getting into a big room with a good microphone and recording. And this goes right into my next tip. Record on the best equipment and in the best space possible. I have a smartphone, like I'm sure many of you do as well, and it's very tempting to just go into a small practice room, put a smartphone on a metal stand right in front of you, hit record, and then lay down some tracks. I'm going to strongly encourage you not to do that, not to take that approach in preparing these materials, because as wonderful as smartphones can be, the microphones are not going to be nearly as good as a professional quality microphone that someone like your music teacher is going to have. Really try to get into the best recording space you can. Now, another tip. Make sure that in your practice preparing these materials, preparing anything you're playing in your band or your orchestra, make metronomes and tuners your practice friend. Use them as practice tools. So much of music is subjective, subject to interpretation, but two objective, you could call them scientific empirical truths about music are you playing in tune and are you playing in time? You're either with the beat or you're not. You're either in tune or you're flat or you're sharp. So I encourage, again, smartphones, there are many smartphone metronome tuner apps, but I always encourage students to get a standalone metronome tuner. This is a combo, the Korg, that is actually both. It's a computer that does one thing and it does one thing well. It keeps you in time and in tune, or helps you to stay in time and in tune. So really make these tools your friends in the practice room. A couple more details for you. Anytime you see a term you don't know, and there are a few terms in these materials you're going to play which you may not know. Wagner. So, there are terms you may see in the music and you're like, I have no idea what that means. I don't read German or Italian. Whenever you see a term that you don't know, look it up. Look it up and write it in the music. Composers don't just throw these terms in to confuse you. They don't throw it in there to throw a wrench at you. They do it to help inform you how the music should sound. Speaking of which, speaking of how the music should sound, this applies particularly to when you're preparing solos and excerpts. So tracks 3 and 4 for this audition. The Holst and the Wagner excerpts, listen to the music, listen to the actual piece of music so that you can have that going in your head as you play. You're going to have a much better chance of playing the music correctly, in a correct style, at the correct rhythm, if you hear the music in your ear. And just imagine yourself playing along with a band, with an orchestra in your head. Really strive to hear the music as you play. One more thing. You may notice when I play each track that the fingers I'm throwing down are different than the fingerings you're using. This is because the tuba I'm using is a C tuba, not a B flat tuba like you will most likely be using. So the first track that you're going to need to record is a chromatic scale from low G, G1, an octave below the bass clef staff, up to G3, G at the top of the bass clef staff, and then back down again. Very simple rhythm, quarter notes all the way up and down, except for the half note at the end, which should be twice as long. So, some tips for this. First of all, don't neglect the scale in favor of tracks 2, 3, and 4. Make sure that you do practice this chromatic scale. And again, work with your metronome and your tuner. Keep that rhythm present and exact. Use the metronome to really make sure that you are staying at 120 beats per minute, that each and every quarter note comes in right exactly in time. A little tip for hearing the tempo, 120, think Stars and Stripes Forever by John Philip Sousa. Dun 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 dun. Let's test me. How close was I? Dun 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 dun. I was pretty close. So sometimes it's useful, whether it's a Sousa march, whether it's a rock tune. Sometimes it's helpful if you need to hear a particular tempo, have a song in mind for that particular tempo. So for 120 beats per minute, it's Stars and Stripes Forever. But again, in addition to keeping it in time, keep it in tune. As you play each note going up and down the scale, make sure that you're really hitting dead center on the tuner, that you're really hitting that center green light, that you're not flat, that you're not sharp. Now, what's really important, what's actually in a sense more important than playing in tune, however, is making your best, fullest sound. We don't want a sound that is pinched or pressed. We want to make sure that we're really trying to fill the space with our best tuba sound. The tuba, more than any other brass instrument, needs to have a voluminous, wide, broad sound. It's the subwoofer of the brass section. It is the bass voice. So to achieve this, a couple of tips. Really make sure that you're really maximizing your airflow. Try to move as much air across the lips as you can. Now, don't do that in such a way that your lips completely blow apart. You still have to form your embouchure. You still have to have your corners set and blow to and through the center of the lips. But trying to avoid, again, pinching, the idea of just pressing the lips together and using the absolute minimum amount of air you can get away with. That's not going to give you the type of sound you want. You want to try and default to using as much air as you can without the sound spreading. This is particularly going to be important at the beginning and the end of the scale. When you're in that low register, little tip, the lower you play on any brass instrument, not just tuba, the more air is required. So especially on the opening low G, really expand, really fill the horn as much as you can. Another thing that'll help with really, again, avoiding a pinched or pressed sound, really keeping the sound open and pure, open vowel. We should always think ah or o. Now, depending on your mouthpiece, your face, you may find that an ah vowel works better for you, or some others you may find that o, a more rounded o, works. Experiment. Try playing just simple long tones in a slow tempo and try playing with a ta, and then try playing to, and see which shape gives you a better sound, and then use that vowel. Another thing to be mindful of is the fact that we don't have a dynamic indication. We have tempo indication, and we even have an articulation indication, which we'll talk about in a second. We don't have a dynamic indication here. So in this case, I would encourage you to play at a comfortably loud dynamic, mezzo forte to forte. Bear in mind that brass instruments are what we call acoustically reflexive. They're essentially amplifiers, non-electric amplifiers. So take advantage of that. Brass instruments have an easier time playing louder than softer. So there's no reason not to play this scale at a comfortably loud dynamic. So make sure that you're not just filling the horn with air, but that the air is fast across the lips. That air has a certain amount of speed and energy to it. Don't hesitate. Don't slow the air down so much or be hesitant with the wind such that notes don't speak. The front of each note, even though it's a legato articulation, the front of the note should still be like an explosion of wind. In fact, talking about articulation, the thing that's going to make this scale legato in articulation as opposed to a default articulation, a marcato, or an accent, is that instead of using the letter T, use the letter D at the front of each note. So depending on whether you're using an ah vowel or an o vowel, da or do instead of ta or to. For most aspects of our playing, we're going to use a strong letter T. You're going to need that for the track too. But for here, use a letter D. Use something a little bit softer, more driven by the wind. And also, on that note, make sure that you're really sustaining. In addition to playing this legato, I would think maximum sustain. Really blow the air all the way to the very back of each note. Think of each note as a brick of wind. Last tip for this before I play it for you. Make sure that when you play, that you're really striving for a dial tone concept of sound. Now, we don't want to have the tone, the timbre of this dial tone, because this doesn't sound like a tuba at all. But what it does have is a consistency of pitch. It's not wavering, it's not going sharp and flat, it's not oscillating on either sides of in tune. It's a dial. If we saw this horizontally, it would be a flat line. No flatness, no sharpness. We want to emulate that as we play. So for each note, strive that, again, a brick of sound that doesn't rise flat or sharp. Try to keep the air steady and constantly blowing forward through every note. The second track that tuba players will need to record is a selection from the Arbenz method for tuba. Specifically, it's a Studies in Syncopation, Etude number 19. Now, before I talk about this track, I want to take a brief moment and talk about the Arbenz method. If you don't already own the Arbenz method, I would strongly encourage you to buy one and to make it a part of your daily practice. Obviously, I'm a professional musician, I teach, I perform. This method is something that I use in my daily practice. Even today, I've had the book for, feels like forever. It's been like 20 years. I still use it regularly. It is a regular part of my practice. And it's something you never really run out of things to work on. It's that good a resource. In terms of which version you get, there's a relatively new, updated version by Jerry Young and Wes Jacobs. Sometimes tuba players will use the trombone euphonium version, the Carl Fischer, which is everything is up an octave. This is going to be a more affordable option, and it has the advantage of forcing you to read things up an octave. So it's written up an octave, you have to play it down an octave. That's a good practice for playing string-based music, because that's essentially the same transposition. Again, either of those would be good versions of the Arbenz method to acquire. So, the first thing here to make note of is the articulation style. Notice how there's a preponderance of staccatos throughout this etude. So clearly, this kind of gives us a hint of what this etude is testing. It's testing your ability to play staccato. And what is staccato? It is not short. Staccato is lifted and buoyant. Try not to think of staccato as as short as possible. That's a different articulation. Staccatos, think of them as bouncy or floating. Ta, ta, ta. So even though the note body is shorter than on a full-length note, the air shouldn't have a hard stop at the end of the note. It should have a resonance that goes beyond the end of the note, even as your lips stop buzzing. In other words, for each note, think bounce or lift. Don't think short. We want crisp, clear, centered attacks on every single note. Now, to help achieve this, in addition to, again, really trying to fill the instrument with wind, what's really going to help here is a strong letter T. Ta, 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 ta. So if you wind pattern, if you just say and speak the notes or just or wind pattern. If you do that, what you really want to hear is a very crisp explosion of air at the start of each note. So the tongue is strong, but it's always driven by the wind. Now, because this exercise occurs in the mid to upper register, you don't have to worry about trying to maximize your airflow through the instrument quite as much as you do in the low register, like on the chromatic scale. Upper register, mid to upper register playing, it's not pinched. You're not pressing the lips together as hard as you can. You need to think narrow, focused air. A good concept for, basically playing in the staff and above is think of your airstream as being like canned air. For those of you who maybe have, desktop PCs or gaming PCs, if you've ever seen canned air, so it looks like a can of WD-40 or something, but it's just compressed oxygen with a very small straw at the end, and you press on it and it blows dust out of your console. We want to have a similar movement of air the higher we play on any brass instrument, not just tuba. So, for example, listen to me wind pattern, just a few measures of this again. So especially when I go to that high G in measure 3, you notice how much more pressurized that wind is than the G an octave below at the end of the first measure. There's another notice, you probably can't notice it because the camera's facing straight on, but if I was facing to the side, you would notice that my bottom lip actually comes in slightly. When we move into the medium upper register of our instrument, you're going to find that rather than blowing straight ahead into the mouthpiece, one of your lips, most likely your bottom lip, is actually going to curve in so that the airstream can bend. So the higher you play, I would encourage you to try blowing downwards. The higher you play, try blowing at more and more of a downward angle. Again, don't pinch, just let that bottom lip roll onto your teeth. Now, if this causes you problems, if this makes everything worse, then you can try the opposite. Then you can try kicking the bottom lip out forward, kick the jaw forward, just a little bit, and see if it doesn't help you hit these notes with a little bit less pinched, a little bit more effortless sound. Now, one more note on the articulation, on the staccatos. Notice that we also have staccatos on a lot of these quarter notes at the ends of phrases. Bear in mind that a staccato quarter note is twice the length of a staccato eighth note, which of course itself is twice the length as a staccato 16th note. The reason I say this is avoid the temptation to just play the quarter notes as short as the eighth notes and 16th notes. The quarter notes, a staccato quarter note equals, think of it this way, a staccato quarter note equals a tenuto eighth note, a full length eighth note. So those quarter notes at the end of phrases should have not just a lift, but a buoyance and a little bit more weight. Ta 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 ta. Just a little bit more breath to the sound on those notes. Now, the rhythm here is quarter note equals 88. Or rather, tempo is quarter note equals 88. Be careful not to rush. Because of how energetic this music is in terms of the articulation, you're going to find that it's going to be very easy to rush. So keep the tempo, again, use your metronome and really keep it locked in at 88 beats per minute. Last point, even though this is essentially an articulation exercise, a rhythmic syncopation study, can you be consistent with your time, perfect with your rhythm, make this musical. Make a musical statement. You have basically musical sentences or phrases or gestures every 4 measures. So within each gesture, you'll hear me do this when I play it, try to find the most important notes and then drive into those notes. And then once we reach those arrival points, maybe back off. And when I say drive into and back off, I mean crescendo and decrescendo. So as we get louder, we speed the air up across the lips, and as we back off, as we kind of resolve and play softer, we slow the air down across the lips. So the third track that you're going to need to record is our first excerpt of this audition. It's a selection from Holst's first suite in E-flat. It's the first movement, which is entitled Chaconne, which goes back to one of my general tips for you. The first thing you should ask yourself, what's a chaconne? What is that? So, a chaconne is what's known as a continuous variation, which is based upon a ground bass, a 8 measure, in this case, repeating melody. Notice how the first 8 measures are repeated. Essentially measures, well, measure 1 is a pickup. Measures 2 through 9 are then repeated in measures 10 to the end of the selection. It's literally the same notes, the same rhythm. So listen to this movement. Listen to the first movement of the Holst and hear how this repeating 8 measure ground bass essentially is kind of held as this structural item, and then the variation comes from the different counter melodies that Holst stacks on top of it. Another thing to bear in mind here is look at the dynamic. We have our first indicated piano dynamic of the audition. So this is an opportunity for you to demonstrate that you can play softly but still with a good controlled sound. So here's the mistake a lot of players make, is that at the soft dynamics they pinch. They either hold back, they restrict the airflow into the instrument, or they pinch. Don't do that. All you do when you play softer is slow the air down. You still flow, the air still flows as freely as possible into the instrument. It simply flows more slowly. Think about the difference between a car driving 35 miles an hour down a road versus when you put a car in drive and you just let it idle forward at like 2 or 3 miles an hour. When you're going for slower dynamics, try to be that car that's just idling forward very slowly, as opposed to, so this airstream, you can hear it. It's actually physically louder just blowing across the aperture. That's going to be a louder dynamic than that haunted mansion wind, that slow, soft quality. That's going to, if I had a horn on my face, a mouthpiece on my face, that would have corresponded to a softer note. Now, that being said, you want to make melodic contrast of dynamics. You want to show good musical intentions here. So we have a melody, an 8 measure melody that then repeats going into measure 10. So I would encourage you to make some kind of contrast with the dynamic. In the second phrase, again, starting pickups in measure 10, I would encourage you probably play a little louder, closer to mezzo piano. I don't know if I would go any louder in mezzo forte, but show some kind of contrast between the two phrases. Speaking of phrasing, show the melodic shape of this gesture. Even though the ground bass is very repetitive and the rhythm is very simple, these notes are not all equal. Some notes drive into the other notes. Same thing we talked about with the Arbin syncopation study. Show where the music is going. Which notes are important notes that we're driving towards, which notes are simply notes that we're driving through. So where are the arrival points, and then crescendoing to those arrival points, and then maybe decrescendoing away from those arrival points. Another thing to bear in mind here is articulation. Notice we have a preponderance of slurs here, essentially 4 measure slurs. I would encourage you to slur this excerpt if you can, but if you find that you have trouble centering notes, then go ahead and bring back the legato tonguing from the chromatic scale. So again, using your letter D, Da, or Do attacks. But again, just make sure that the sound is as smooth and sustained as possible. Notice that there's not an explicit tempo indication here. All we have is allegro moderato. So again, this is part of the reason why we listen to recordings, to try to ground ourselves a little bit and say, how fast should this be? I would encourage, as a ballpark figure, between quarter note equals 84 to 92. And I would probably aim for around 88. You'll find that a good number of recordings are in that neighborhood of tempo, but find your favorite recording. Find a band recording that you like, and see what tempo they play at, and then emulate that. Last tip, you'll notice we have some divisi here. The end of measure 9, the end of measure 5, again measure 10, 13. I would go ahead and encourage you to take the bottom divisi throughout this excerpt. So the final track that you'll need to record is the overture to Richard Wagner's Die Meistersinger. This piece is one of the most frequently asked excerpts when you have a principal tuba audition for the New York Philharmonic, Seattle Symphony, so on and so forth. This is a very, very common piece to have excerpts drawn from. And there are a couple of excerpts that you'll sometimes see on these auditions, including what you're about to play here. The first thing, right at the outset, notice we have not one but two terms to look up. If you're not German, if you don't speak German, you probably don't know what sehr massig bewegt means or sehr gehalten, which is underneath the staff. So again, anytime you don't know a term, look it up, but just for now, I'll give them to you. Sehr in German means very. So sehr massig bewegt basically means a very moderate speed with movement, with agitation. So that speaks to the tempo, which again, indicated tempo is quarter note equals 92 to 112. That's a pretty wide tempo range. Just as a general rule, I would aim right for the middle. So I would aim right around quarter note equals 100 to 102. Just aim for that, and you shouldn't be too fast or too slow for whoever's listening and judging the audition excerpts. The second expressive marking we want to know and write into the music is sehr gehalten. Again, sehr means very. Gehalten means sustained. You want to play this whole passage very tenuto. Much like the Holst, much like the chromatic scale, and quite the opposite to the Arben, the second track you had to play. This should be maximum sustained, really blowing all the way to the back of the note. Now, obviously, you will need to breathe, and you'll notice where I take breaths, but to the extent possible, we want to really hide those breaths, and we really want to just try to, again, blow all the way to the back of each note. You almost want to think, especially on longer notes, half notes, studded half notes, whole notes, any tied notes, you really want to almost think of there being a slight crescendo of the wind as you blow all the way through to the back of each note. Another thing to bear in mind is that we have our first written forte of the audition. So it should be a full, loud sound, lots of fast air blowing into the tuba. This is your opportunity to demonstrate that you can fill the horn with wind, and fast wind, fast, warm, moist wind, without the sound spreading or getting out of control. Another thing to bear in mind here is the importance of agogic accents. And this goes to the idea of showing where the music's going, showing musical direction. When we talk about agogic accents, we're talking about the fact that there are, in any piece of music, in any measure, there are weak beats and there are strong beats. And weak beats, especially in a piece like this, should always flow like a river into the strong beats. So for example, you have a lot of pickup patterns. Think about the eighth notes picking up into measure 5, measure 6, 1 and 2 and 3. Anytime you have eighth notes kind of driving into a longer note, we should crescendo through those eighth notes. We should always drive through the short notes into the longer notes. A good example of this is when you look at measures 10 and 11. Notice how measures 10, there's and 4 and 1, and 4 and 1. These pickups, and 4 and 1, into the next downbeat. Think these lyrics when you're playing those eighth notes. This one's for you. This one's for you. The emphasis when you say that sentence, this one's for you. No, not you. This one's for you. You is the point of emphasis for that sentence. Musically, those eighth notes, those first three notes, are driving into the downbeat. This one's for you. So that's just a little phrase you can have in your head when you play these pickups. And even in the running eighth notes in measures 19 and 20, when you have that measure 19, that first downbeat, eighth note, and 2 and should drive into beat 3. And then the and 4 and should drive into the next one. Bum 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 bum. So in other words, it should sound like this. You, this one's for you, this one's for you, this one's for you. So again, bear in mind that we really want to be driving, particularly in the beats 1 and 3. We should always drive through the weak beats into the next strong beat. One more thing to bear in mind. Listen to recordings of this. Again, just to give you a sense for what tempo you want to play it at, the style, just so you can hear what sehr gehalten, sehr massig bedeckt sounds like. You can hear a good forte dynamic. Something to bear in mind. The first 8 measures line up to the actual music, but then there's a series of rests where the tuba does not play before the next big entrance with the tuba. Then you will hear the figure at measure 9. So bear in mind that there is you'll hear the first 8 measures in what you have written, then there's some measures of rest, and then you'll hear the tuba come in measure 9, but it won't be the actual 9th measure of the actual overture. They just cut out the rest for the purposes of this audition. Yeah, another thing, one more thing. We have forte at the beginning, so obviously you want to try and demonstrate a full sound, but bear in mind that you want to show peaks and valleys. Some notes are going to be louder than others, so try to show a shape and try to really drive all the way to that very last G in the very last measure. Find a way to show us moving, constantly building the energy all the way to the end of the excerpt. I wish you best of luck on the upcoming audition. I hope this video has been helpful and answered some of your questions about how to approach preparing them. If you have any further questions for me about tuba playing, these materials in general, feel free to reach out. My contact info could be found below.